In the misty dawn of a private mountain retreat, a self-righteous eco-warrior turns your sanctuary into a glitter-soaked hippie invasion until karma arrives with horns, hooves, and a bellow that shatters delusions. At precisely 5:47 in the morning, I was jolted awake by the unmistakable sound of a didgeridoo echoing through the trees, followed by what I can only describe as a half-naked man in a glow-in-the-dark loincloth sprinting past my window while screaming something about chakra alignment and bears. At first, I thought I was still dreaming, or maybe I died in my sleep and somehow reincarnated into a wilderness-themed EDM festival. But no, when I stepped outside with a cup of coffee in hand and a pair of wool socks hanging half on, I was greeted by a scene so chaotic and baffling that for a moment I forgot I was standing on my own private mountain land. Tents, hundreds of them, hammocks strung between trees like some kind of hippie spider colony. There were women twirling LED hula hoops in a field I had seeded with wild grass just last fall. A shirtless man was climbing the flagpole I had installed by the cabin deck, chanting something about cosmic liberty. And at the very center of it all, on top of my antique picnic table, stood Karen, megaphone in hand, arms raised like she was leading a revolution. My cabin, my land, my quiet weekend retreat had been transformed into a festival called, according to the sign made out of spray-painted bed sheets, Camp Heal Thyself, a communal rebirth experience. I didn't know what was worse. The fact that Karen had orchestrated this disaster or that she'd invited over 100 people to trespass on my property in the name of cosmic healing. But I said nothing. I sipped my coffee, looked at the sun still low on the horizon, and smiled a little. She had no idea that she'd picked the wrong weekend to declare war on someone who just bought 3 bulls from Luis the Hornmaster. I went back inside and calmly shut the door as if the swirling mass of body glitter, hemp tents, and unauthorized campfires wasn't real. But it was. I wasn't hallucinating. The land I had purchased 3 years ago, fenced, cleared, legally registered, and poured every ounce of weekend labor into, had been taken over like a Woodstock flash mob. It was all Karen. It was always Karen, the self-proclaimed earth guardian of our loose mountain community, the woman who wore fur in July because it was from her ancestral totem goat and who believed any land not actively covered in Walmart parking lot stripes belonged to the people. When I confronted her a few months back about wandering onto my land to hold moonlit drumming sessions, she'd responded by saying, "If the deer don't recognize fences, neither does she. So I'd put up better fences." She responded by putting up signs just outside them that said, "Corporate greed zone begins here." That woman had built an entire narrative in her head that my modest 2-bedroom log cabin made me some kind of capitalist overlord. And now, judging by the way she was shouting into that megaphone while someone live-streamed her from a drone, she was clearly doubling down. As I walked through the thicket toward the lower clearing, the scale of the damage started to hit me. My hiking trails were covered in makeshift composting toilets. My fire ring had been converted into an herbal tea bar. Someone had hung tapestries between trees advertising Reichian sessions and anti-vaccine seminars. A teenage boy with glitter on his cheeks offered me something called cosmic stew from a biodegradable cup. And not a single one of them seemed the least bit concerned that they were squatting on private land. Karen had clearly told them this was all free and open territory, like some kind of national forest annexed from reality. I stopped in front of the camper van she was using as a base camp and tried to speak with her like a reasonable person. She didn't even let me finish. She wagged her finger in my face and told me this space was now sovereign land, a gift back to the people from years of colonial extraction. I reminded her this land was legally mine, deed in hand. She told me the earth doesn't recognize deeds. I told her the county court sure as hell does. That's when she introduced her piece de resistance, a wrinkled, crooked piece of paper that she claimed was a permit. It looked like it had been printed at a gas station kiosk and signed with a purple crayon. She said it was from an organization called the Mountain Sovereignty and Earth Healing Council. I looked it up. It was a blog she ran with one follower herself. When I pointed this out, she told me I was oppressing her with my facts and I'd better be careful before I found myself spiritually evicted. I turned to leave, but not before I caught wind of a chant starting behind me. The crowd was repeating her slogans in unison, chanting things like, "Reclaim the peaks and let the soil speak." One guy had a conch shell. Another banged a tambourine. I walked away numb but not defeated because in that moment I remembered something I had once heard from Luis the Hornmaster, a man who bred bulls and wisdom in equal measure. He once said, "When the fools dance too long on your porch, send in the horns at sunrise." And I kept his number. I drove back down the mountain to get signal and made a quiet call. Luis answered on the second ring. He said the bulls were ready. I said I had oats, speakers, a plan, and a fence schematic. He chuckled and told me this would be the most fun they'd had since the county rodeo got cancelled. I told him to meet me Friday night. I would need a dawn deployment. As I drove back up past Karen's cult of misfit campers and stolen parking spots, I kept a calm smile on my face. They thought they were winning. They thought I was backing down. They had no idea that the next sunrise would come with 4 tons of snorting, stomping, oat-chasing karma. The kind with curved horns, loud bellows, and enough intimidation factor to send 100 crystal-toting festival-goers sprinting back to their yoga mats. That evening, I didn't try to stop them. I just watched. Karen stood on my porch drinking kombucha and telling her followers that no authority could remove them. People were pitching more tents in the wildflower meadow. Someone set up a projection screen to show a documentary about fermented cabbage, but I was already 20 steps ahead. I moved my valuables to a hidden stone shed I'd built last year after a storm. I set up cameras, solar-powered speakers, and oat feeders on a timer. Every detail was in place. By the time the stars came out and Karen began her full moon sermon, preaching about the age of rewilding, I was already tucked into a cot inside my rock-solid shack, resting up for the moment the forest would wake in a storm of confused footsteps and panicked glitter. The best revenge, I reminded myself as I set my alarm for 5:30, is not loud. It's not angry. It doesn't rant or rave or wave paper permits in the wind. The best revenge is calm, strategic, and best served by hoof at sunrise. Karen stood at the center of my lower field like a self-declared war general basking in the glow of her own delusion. Megaphone in one hand, mason jar in the other, shouting proclamations about nature's liberation and the downfall of landowning tyranny. Around her, the scene had escalated into something almost performance art level absurd. A circle of barefoot dancers chanted in rhythmic disarray while a man in a sun hat painted tree bark with what he claimed were sacred mushroom runes. Near my rain catchment barrels, someone had set up a juice cleanse station offering fermented beet elixirs in exchange for positive vibes and Instagram follows. I watched the circus unfold from the edge of my cabin steps, invisible to them all in a flannel shirt and growing sense of disbelief. These weren't just campers. They were full-blown acolytes of the Karen cult, and my mountain had become their sanctuary. Or so they thought. Karen had installed a makeshift sign nailed to 2 birch poles that read, "Welcome to the Free Zone" in glitter pen and permanent marker, which would have been laughable if it hadn't been hammered directly into the tree I'd planted for my dad's memorial. It was one thing to trespass. It was another to hijack the land's meaning. I couldn't decide what annoyed me more. The fact that she had declared sovereignty over my own soil, or that her camp had actual volunteers now setting up recycling zones, as if it were a sanctioned music festival. None of them realized they were being puppeteered by a woman who once threatened to sue a farmer's market for selling non-organic pumpkins. Everywhere I turned, there were signs of disarray dressed as enlightenment. My fence line was draped in Tibetan flags and bandanas dipped in what someone claimed was full moon essence. The meditation dome, assembled from stolen pool noodles and painter's plastic, had become the de facto nap station for anyone who overdid it on Karen's sacred cacao blend. Near the back of the clearing, I found my firewood pile turned into a crude sculpture of what I can only describe as a cross between a deer and a light bulb. A woman with dreadlocks offered to give me a spiritual aura cleanse with a feather soaked in vinegar, completely unaware I was the property owner she believed she was liberating the land from. When I told her I didn't want my aura scrubbed with pantry items, she blinked slowly and said I had the voice of a wounded banker. I considered correcting her, but I figured it was better she kept thinking I was just another local passerby because the less they knew about my intentions, the easier it would be when things turned. Karen, meanwhile, strutted across the campsite like she was mayor of some lost utopia, doling out hugs and enlightenment, assuring everyone that they were part of a spiritual renaissance. She took particular pleasure in climbing onto a log stage someone had built using my old deck planks, delivering midday sermons about why fences are a symptom of inner trauma. I tried to keep my presence low-key, wandering as an observer, quietly logging every violation and photographing her speeches for the sheriff. It was when she spotted me sipping coffee near the composting toilet station that she decided to pounce. She marched over, followed by 2 clipboard-carrying followers and one guy who called himself Solar Mike and demanded I remove myself from her sacred community space before I infected it with toxic property owner energy. I asked her again politely to pack up and leave. She smiled like someone who thought they were in a courtroom drama and said the forest had chosen her. I reminded her this wasn't a forest. It was a parcel of land with a recorded deed, surveyed, taxed, and held in my name with the full backing of county property law. She waved her megaphone like it was a royal scepter, and said that man-made laws held no power in zones of awakened consciousness. Then she turned to her entourage and said, I was an agent of the grid, whatever that meant. They nodded solemnly like she just decoded the Matrix. I could feel the tension building. Karen had done something clever. She wasn't just trespassing. She'd turned the act of trespassing into a community bonding ritual. These people weren't just campers. They were emotionally invested in her fantasy of communal land rebirth. If I brought law enforcement now, it would spark a protest, maybe even chaos, and the cleanup would be mine. No, this needed precision and patience. So I said nothing and walked away slowly, ignoring her dramatic gasps and her insistence that I was retreating because my capitalist heart couldn't handle pure joy. That night, her little community threw what they called a freedom fireside ceremony. I watched from the shadows of the ridge trail as Karen donned a robe made of recycled potato sacks and led chants about dissolving borders while people passed around hand drums and questionable brownies. They were so engrossed in their Kumbaya cosplay that they didn't notice the small red markers I placed at the edges of the field. Motion sensor points, audio trigger posts, bull trail boundaries, each one carefully plotted with a GPS tracker and calibrated down to the meter. Luis would be proud. I'd already tested the oat buckets twice. If all went to plan, each bull would be drawn toward a sound pattern synced to the stage speakers. No need for chaos, just intimidation and movement. These were trained bulls. No one would get hurt, but no one would want to stay either. The next morning, I made myself visible again, this time near the communal shower stall that had been constructed from stolen tarps and optimism. A few of the campers recognized me, though none connected me to the cabin. Karen approached hotly as ever and asked if I had come to renounce my ownership and rejoin the tribe. I told her I was just here to observe. She said that was fine, but if I stayed too long, I'd need to sign the consciousness contract. I asked what that was. She handed me a crumpled paper covered in multicolored ink that declared anyone within the free zone agreed to live by principles of shared intention, cosmic sovereignty, and emotional transparency. When I asked who enforced this, she smiled and said, "We all do." That's when I realized this wasn't just a party. This was Karen's personal cult startup. I watched a young man approach her, eager to show her his hand-drawn logo for what he called tribe tokens, a fake currency based on leaf etchings and dream interpretations. She approved it with a solemn nod and declared him the economy steward. He cried. I took note. They weren't just followers. They were building something they thought was real, which meant the fall would be even more dramatic. Later that day, a sheriff's deputy stopped by after one of my quiet calls, just to check things out. Karen intercepted him before he could reach the cabin, armed with her crayon permit and a headband made of garlic. She told him this land was sovereign and that she was in the middle of a week-long summit. The deputy looked baffled, then amused, and eventually agreed to return with more support and legal documentation. Karen filmed him narrating the interaction like it was a scene in a documentary about land liberation. I smiled at the deputy on his way out and he nodded. We both knew time was on our side. By the time the second full day of Karen's commune carnival had unfolded across my land like an accidental Renaissance fair powered by kombucha and delusion, I had slipped completely into the role of background fixture. A quiet and unassuming observer moving like a ghost along the edge of chaos. No one questioned me anymore, not even Karen, who had apparently concluded that I had been spiritually broken by the overwhelming beauty of her free zone utopia and had accepted my place as a passive woodland bystander. It was precisely where I wanted to be. I didn't challenge her. I didn't argue. I didn't even flinch when 2 shirtless drummers moved a sacred sweat circle into my gravel driveway and started yelping at the moon through flutes carved out of PVC pipe. I simply nodded, jotted a few notes into the small leather-bound field journal I kept in my back pocket, and quietly continued with my real task, which had absolutely nothing to do with awakening my inner pine tree, and everything to do with transforming her grand vision into a memory so embarrassing it would haunt her every sag-drenched daydream for years to come. The work was mostly technical now. I spent the better part of that day moving through the thickets and tree lines surrounding my lower clearing, calibrating the final details of what I was privately calling Operation Dawn Herd. There were 8 remote audio devices, 4 motion triggers, and 3 oat buckets. Each oat bucket was baited with a specific blend Luis had recommended: rolled oats, crushed apple, and molasses. Perfect to draw the attention of Highland bulls with a nose for breakfast. The audio devices were synced to a portable mixer I'd set up inside my tool shed, which was shielded from sight by thick blackberry bramble. The plan wasn't just to release the bulls. It was to control their movement, to orchestrate their presence like a conductor directing a very large, very hairy, very determined orchestra of intimidation. Luis had trained his bulls with absurd precision. They wouldn't charge, wouldn't gore, wouldn't even run unless spooked. They were curious, plodding creatures who followed food and rhythm. But they were massive, loud, and had horns long enough to put fear in the heart of even the most self-assured herbalist. The key was timing, and that required patience. Meanwhile, Camp Heal Thyself had entered its expansion phase. Karen had declared a new zone near the ridge to be the cosmic reflection tier and had people dragging logs up the slope to build a so-called ancestral circle. She renamed the composting toilet village to the Zone of Earth Renewal. I heard a rumor that someone had started assigning roles like Dream Interpreter and Tribal Justice Coordinator. At one point, a tall man with dreadlocks and a raccoon tail had approached me and asked if I'd seen the sacred gong. I said I hadn't. He said that was troubling and disappeared into the woods. No one seemed to notice that I was placing small plastic stakes in the ground, each marked with a tiny orange dot. No one asked why I was adjusting tree branches or why I walked into the thickets with bags of feed over my shoulder. They were too busy practicing interpretive scream therapy or trying to cleanse each other's ancestral guilt through group sobbing under a tree. It was all so absurd. I almost forgot how angry I had been the morning I first discovered them. Almost. But then I would look at my broken fence posts, my crushed flower beds, my trampled hiking trail, and the rage would return in a quiet, icy wave. Karen hadn't just disrespected my land. She had taken ownership of it in her mind, dressed up the theft in dream catchers and folklore, and weaponized ideology to rally 100 people into her illusion. It was bold, manipulative, and ridiculous, and that made it all the more satisfying to know that her entire operation was balanced on a lie she had convinced herself was truth. That night, as the moon rose and another ceremonial drum circle began echoing through the trees, I hiked up the service trail behind the cabin to the upper ridge where Luis was waiting with his trailer and his bulls. We greeted each other like old friends quietly and without ceremony. Luis had brought 3 bulls, Paco, Thunder, and Basil, and they stood inside the partitioned trailer like statues, chewing calmly and occasionally snorting into the cool air. Luis looked out over the camp below, his expression unreadable. I showed him the map I'd drawn, a hand-sketched layout of the entire area with markers for sound triggers, oat zones, and movement paths. He nodded, asked a few technical questions, and then smiled. He told me this was easily the strangest favor he'd ever agreed to, but it would be a performance they'd never forget. We spent the next hour unloading and securing the animals behind a temporary pen, hidden just behind the tree line, well out of sight of the campers. They'd stay there overnight, calm and contained, until morning when we'd begin the release sequence. Each bull had a small GPS collar synced to my phone so I could monitor their path in real time. Luis gave me a final reminder about the sounds they preferred. The low cowbell tone followed by oat rustle, and then handed me a small handheld clicker just in case I needed manual override. He left just before midnight, leaving me alone with 3 bulls, a handful of oat buckets, and a phone full of vengeance. By then, the camp had quieted to a low buzz of sleeping bags and murmured conversations beneath tarp canopies. Karen had ended her nightly manifesto with a ritual called Burning of the Boundaries, during which people wrote down their greatest fears and burned them in a small fire pit made from my gardening stones. I watched from the shadows as she raised her arms and declared the land reborn, free from limitation and oppressive energy. I wondered how free it would feel when a 1,000-pound Highland bull wandered through her circle of divine consciousness at dawn. I walked back to the cabin and double-checked the speaker's sync system, tested the cowbell audio through a pair of wireless earbuds and activated the oat bucket releases. Everything was set. I set my alarm for 5:25 a.m. and crawled into the stone shack I had fortified months ago after a bear incident. The walls were thick. The door latched from inside, and the view gave me full access to the clearing without being visible. It was perfect. I lay back and stared at the ceiling, letting the fatigue settle over me like a final layer of calm before the symphony began. I didn't sleep much. My thoughts kept circling back to Karen and how far she had taken her fantasy. I couldn't understand whether she actually believed what she preached or if it was all a power trip wrapped in wellness jargon. Maybe both, but she had crossed too many lines, rallied too many people, caused too much damage to brush it off as eccentricity. This wasn't about yoga and herbal tea anymore. It was about responsibility. The first glimmers of morning light began to stretch across the treetops just after 5:30, casting a pale gold shimmer through the mist as the mountain yawned and the earth held its breath for what was about to unfold. The camp was still sleeping, nestled in its bed of collective delusion, unaware that the spiritual stillness they so worshipped was about to be pierced by something far more primal than incense and soft chants. Inside my stone shack, I rose quietly at the sound of my alarm, silenced it with a single tap, and moved with deliberate precision. My phone lit up with the GPS feed. 3 blinking dots representing Paco, Thunder, and Basil, still stationary, still calm. I stepped outside into the chilled morning air, the smell of damp earth and wood smoke mingling faintly as I stood there just for a moment, listening to the silence. A heavy stillness lay across the clearing below, a temporary illusion of peace, like the final exhale before a storm. I reached into my pocket and pressed the first button on the remote audio system. The cowbell tone rang out from the speakers I had hidden inside the Freedom stage structure. It was subtle at first, almost gentle, but unmistakably foreign to a place that had until now been saturated with flutes and tambourines. Moments later, I triggered the oat release buckets via the app. Each mechanism dropped its blend of oats, apple mash, and molasses onto the forest floor in strategic zones that would draw the bulls directly into the heart of the camp. Then I waited. The first bull to respond was Paco. The GPS dot began to drift south toward the meadow with lazy interest, as though he had simply awoken from a nice dream and remembered breakfast was being served nearby. Thunder followed moments later, his route weaving slightly toward the composting toilet village. Basil, ever the slow starter, took a little more coaxing, but when I triggered a second cowbell audio tone from the side speaker near the ancestral circle, he began to move with steady intent. Down in the camp, a few heads began to stir in tents and hammocks. A child yawned loudly. A man emerged in a poncho and scratched his beard, oblivious to the coming stampede of sleepy-eyed justice. The bulls weren't running. That wasn't their style. They walked like giants with a purpose. Their massive frames rustling leaves and snapping branches as they advanced with the calm inevitability of a rolling tide. The first screams erupted just before 5:50 a.m. A woman with a glitter-painted face spotted Paco meandering through the meditation dome and let out a strangled yelp. Her cry startled a group of crystal readers who looked up to find Thunder sniffing at their incense tray. Chaos spread fast. A man in tight spandex and a feathered headband darted from his tent and ran straight into Basil, who simply blinked at him with mild confusion, then kept walking. From my perch above the camp, I watched the panic unfold with both satisfaction and a twinge of awe. It was like watching an ant colony suddenly disturbed by a misplaced boot. Campers stumbled out of tents, flailing and shrieking, not quite sure what they were running from, but absolutely certain it involved horns. The Freedom stage erupted into bedlam as Paco nudged the scaffolding and caused the banner reading, "Welcome to the Free Zone," to collapse dramatically onto a screaming man holding a smoothie. Karen emerged from her camper in a flowing robe, bleary-eyed and barefoot, holding her megaphone like a sword. At first, she tried to take command of the situation, shouting into the device that this was a natural test from Gaia, that the bulls were symbolic messengers sent to cleanse the land of false attachments. But even her most loyal devotees weren't buying it. When Basil snorted loudly and pawed at the earth near the food table, half the crowd bolted in the direction of the road, abandoning tents, drums, and half-eaten vegan stews. Karen tried to rally them, shouting that fear was the real enemy, but then Thunder strolled up the porch steps of my cabin and let out a low, guttural bellow that echoed through the clearing like an ancient war horn. That was the tipping point.
The dam broke. Whatever half-baked loyalty they had to Karen's vision of communal transcendence was replaced by raw, unfiltered survival instinct.
People ran, some barefoot, some half-dressed, some clutching sleeping bags or dogs or mason jars filled with herbal concoctions. They poured out of the camp like water from a burst pipe, tripping over fire pits and screaming about satanic rituals and government bioweapons. One man dove into the creek and stayed submerged up to his neck, watching with wide eyes as Paco wandered past his campsite. Another woman tried to climb a tree, only to realize halfway up that it was mostly rotten, and she had no idea how to descend. I watched it all unfold, not with malice, but with a strange sense of poetic justice. They had come to this place thinking it was theirs to shape, to co-opt, to claim through belief and collective imagination. But the mountain, the land, the raw physical truth of this place, none of it bowed to ideology. It answered to reality, and today reality had horns.
Karen, to her credit, tried one last dramatic flourish.
She stepped in front of Paco, arms spread wide, chanting some mixture of Latin and Sanskrit about rebirth and boundaries.
Paco blinked once, leaned forward, and sniffed her robe.
Then, unimpressed, he turned and walked around her, snorting softly. She looked furious, not afraid.
Furious like she was insulted that even the bulls didn't recognize her authority.
She turned to face her remaining followers, a dwindling group of confused and trembling campers clinging to each other beneath a collapsed tapestry, and yelled that they had failed the test, that their fear had undone their spiritual progress, that she alone would stand firm and commune with the animals. Then Basil sneezed in her direction, spraying molasses-speckled oat breath all over her megaphone, and she finally broke. She screamed, a full high-pitched, unfiltered scream, and then she ran.
It took only 15 minutes for the entire camp to unravel.
Tents were left half-zipped.
Backpacks were abandoned mid-trail.
One man threw an entire acoustic guitar into a bush like it might slow down the bulls. I waited another 20 before descending, slowly, making my way down the ridge trail and into the remains of what had once been a functioning, if misguided, camp. The bulls were still calmly sniffing around, munching oats and occasionally bellowing in satisfaction. I patted Thunder on the flank as I passed and made my way to the center of the clearing. The silence was glorious, peaceful.
I looked around at the mess.
Torn tarps, broken camp chairs, glittery face paint jars rolling through the dirt, and took out my phone.
I texted Luis. All clear. He responded almost instantly.
On my way with the trailer. Within the hour, the bulls were being led back to their transport with the kind of affectionate coaxing only Luis could pull off. They followed him like loyal dogs, heads held high, completely unfazed by the chaos they had triggered. Luis chuckled as he loaded them up, shaking his head and muttering something about drama queens in yoga pants. I handed him a fresh loaf of sourdough I'd baked as a thank you, and he told me he'd never forget this gig.
I told him neither would they.
As the truck pulled away, leaving only the faint smell of oats and a few hoof prints in the mud. By the time the last set of hooves had vanished down the mountain trail, with Luis's trailer rumbling off in the distance, the silence that settled over my land was so pure, so earned that it felt almost ceremonial. The birds resumed their morning chatter, the mist curled gently away from the treetops, and the air, previously choked with patchouli and ego, was finally fresh again. But as I stood there in the middle of what had once been Camp Heal Thyself, surrounded by crushed dream catchers, snapped PVC flutes, broken vegan cooking stations, and a toppled sacred yoga dome, I knew the show wasn't over. Not yet, because while the physical trespass had ended, there were still remnants to sweep, both literal and symbolic. The land had been bruised, my rights trampled, and my patience tested far beyond reason. And at the heart of it all was Karen, who for all her dramatic flailing and spiritual posturing, had run from the bulls like a cartoon villain fleeing poetic justice. But she hadn't gone far. She was lurking, hiding, plotting a counterstrike. I could feel it in the air. Sure enough, within 2 hours of the camp's mass exodus, she returned, not with her megaphone or her robe or her chanting circle this time, but with indignation packed into every inch of her posture and a GoPro strapped to her chest. She marched up the slope, her bare feet caked with mud, mascara running down her face like war paint, and stood at the edge of my porch like a deposed queen demanding her throne back. I watched her approach from the same deck she had danced barefoot across 2 days earlier, sipping coffee from the same mug she had once mocked as a symbol of capitalist isolation. She didn't waste time. She pointed at me and accused me of orchestrating a psychological attack on peaceful campers. She said the bulls were weapons of oppression and that I had endangered lives with my toxic masculinity and livestock terrorism. I didn't say a word. I just kept sipping and let her rant. The more she spoke, the more unhinged she sounded, weaving a tale in which I had violated some unwritten cosmic agreement and shattered the sacred harmony of her pop-up utopia. She claimed I had broken the law of vibrational sanctity. I raised an eyebrow and asked her calmly if that was a statute in the county code. She screamed that I would regret mocking the spiritually awakened. That's when the sheriff's truck pulled up. Perfect timing. Deputy Hammond stepped out, looked at the wreckage strewn across my land, then at Karen, who was now gesturing wildly at the broken remains of her camp like a general lamenting the loss of her empire. She tried to approach him, waving a new piece of paper in his face. This one claiming to be a humanitarian cease and desist order issued by a group called United Souls of Sovereign Earth. He took the paper, looked at it for 3 seconds, then handed it back with the flat tone of a man who'd seen it all and wasn't impressed. He turned to me and asked if I had the footage. I nodded and let him inside, past the wind chimes Karen had nailed to my doorframe and pulled up the security cam footage from the past 3 days. It was all there. Karen declaring ownership of my land. Karen announcing fraudulent permits. Karen leading chants about seizing private property. Karen inciting people to occupy the area while mocking county law. Karen mocking Deputy Hammond during his last visit. And finally Karen proclaiming that nothing and no one could remove her. The deputy watched in silence, nodded and asked for a copy. I handed him a USB drive already loaded and labeled. He stepped back outside and that's when it happened. The arrest. It wasn't dramatic. No sirens, no shouting, no cuffs slammed on the hood. Just a calm explanation from the deputy that Karen was being detained for criminal trespassing, destruction of property, impersonation of a public authority, and organizing an unpermitted gathering on private land. She immediately burst into shrieks, claiming she was being persecuted for her beliefs that the mountains were sacred land and she was their guardian. When she realized it wasn't working, she tried to spin it for the camera strapped to her chest, narrating her own arrest like it was a scene from a documentary, sobbing and calling herself a prisoner of consciousness. The deputy let her finish, then placed her in the back of the truck and drove away, leaving me alone with the aftermath and a deeply satisfying sense of vindication humming in my bones. But the story didn't end there. Not with Karen. That kind of energy doesn't disappear quietly. No. A few days later, I received notice that she had filed a civil complaint against me for emotional distress, alleging that the release of bulls constituted a deliberate act of terror meant to inflict trauma on peaceful citizens. I laughed so hard I almost dropped my coffee. The lawsuit was handwritten, filed in small claims court, and accompanied by photos of the bulls peacefully chewing oats, which she tried to present as evidence of psychological warfare. I countered with footage, written testimony from Louise, and statements from several of her former campers, who had since posted TikToks explaining the absurdity of her cult-like takeover. The hearing was scheduled 2 weeks later, and I arrived in a button-down shirt, hair combed with a thick folder of evidence, while Karen arrived draped in a shawl covered in feathers, carrying a dream catcher and a stack of hand-drawn diagrams showing energy fields disrupted by bovine interference. The judge, a tired woman in her 60s who clearly had no patience for nonsense, let Karen speak first. She rambled for nearly 20 minutes, weaving a tale of spiritual persecution, governmental bias, eco-terrorism, and ancestral disruption. She called me a land colonizer and claimed the bulls were instruments of fear. The judge asked if she had any medical documentation of trauma. Karen said she didn't believe in Western psychiatry. When it was my turn, I played a 5-minute supercut from my security cameras showing Karen staging her camp, yelling at law enforcement, mocking the legal system, and proclaiming dominion over the land. Then I presented Louise's affidavit describing the bulls' training, their controlled release, and the total absence of danger. Finally, I handed over the official land deed, my permits, and a letter from the county confirming Karen had never applied for anything legitimate. The judge stared at the pile of evidence, then looked at Karen, who had started humming under her breath, and sighed audibly. In the driest voice imaginable, she ruled in my favor, dismissed Karen's complaint, and added that the court was referring Karen's actions to local authorities for potential fines and further investigation. Karen stood there, frozen, as though the idea of consequence was something she had never encountered before. She tried to speak again, but the judge cut her off and called the next case. Outside, I passed Karen as she stood muttering about solar alignments and corrupt legal structures. She didn't look at me. She didn't have to. She knew she'd lost. Back at the mountain, I spent the next several days slowly restoring what had been damaged. I fixed the fences, replanted the crushed wildflowers. It should have ended there. It really should have. The bulls had done their work with poetic efficiency. The sheriff had come and gone. Karen had screamed herself hoarse and lost both her court case and her credibility. And the mountain had reclaimed its rightful quiet. The neighbors called it justice. I called it balance. And for a time the air around my cabin returned to its original rhythm. Wind in the trees, the crackle of a fire pit, the scrape of a shovel through dirt as I restored trampled flower beds and replanted saplings where tents once stood. But peace, like firewood, burns quickest when it's made from dry expectation. Because just when I started to believe that the show was over, just when the memory of Karen had begun to fade from the corners of the land, she returned, not in person, not with glitter or banners or delusional declarations, but with something far more irritating: bureaucracy. One rainy Tuesday morning, I received an envelope in the mail stamped with a familiar county seal and the formal dread of a legal document. Inside was a fresh complaint. Karen had filed a motion claiming that the property lines of my cabin were drawn based on outdated topographical records and that the original indigenous pathways, which she now fancied herself guardian of, ran directly through what she called the sacred central axis of her previous gathering. In short, she was now claiming that part of my land by spiritual inheritance belonged to the community she represented, which she had rebranded as the Sovereign Forest Kinship Collective. She wasn't trying to reoccupy, not yet. But she wanted recognition, official acknowledgement that the land she had once trampled in a frenzy of drums and fermented root tea was in some symbolic way not mine. And with that recognition, she requested permission to install a stone marker at the base of the ridge trail commemorating what she called the Great Reawakening of the Eastern Spirit Path, an event which, based on the descriptions in her filings, sounded like a cult retreat mixed with a mid-tier Renaissance fair. I read it 3 times, blinked slowly, then leaned back in my chair and exhaled the kind of exhausted breath reserved for when you realize your opponent doesn't know when they've lost. I wasn't angry, not really, more amused than anything, the way you might feel watching a raccoon try to open a locked toolbox. But still, it couldn't be ignored. I reached for my phone and called the county office who, to their credit, were already aware of Karen's recent activity and had assigned a legal liaison specifically for what they called her recurring land claim episodes. Apparently, she had tried something similar in a nearby meadow owned by a retired librarian, arguing that because she had once had a vision about birch trees there, it counted as ancestral reoccupation. That had been dismissed within hours. But this time, her approach was more convoluted. She had attached diagrams, handwritten maps, citations from obscure spiritual manifestos, and even letters of support from her remaining followers, 2 of whom had legally changed their names to Raven Skywater and Jasper Moonwheel. It was nonsense, but nonsense wrapped in legal formatting, which meant I had to show up for another hearing. So, I dusted off the same folder from before, updated the timeline, added photographs of the restored damage, printed off maps from the county GIS system showing the property lines in crisp digital accuracy, and prepared to face her again. Court was held in the same small government building with flickering fluorescent lights and chairs that always felt slightly too short for any grown man's dignity. Karen arrived in a flowing white robe this time, carrying a staff adorned with twine and bells, and introduced herself as a representative of the Earth Memory Stewardship Guild. She insisted on referring to herself in third person, saying things like, "the steward believes," or "the kinship collective recognizes." The judge, bless her patience, allowed her to speak for exactly 8 minutes before interrupting to ask if any of her evidence involved actual deeds, surveyed boundaries, or state-recognized documentation. Karen responded by reading a passage from a journal she claimed had been dictated to her by the spirit of a deer that once drank from the mountain spring. I kept my face neutral. The judge did not. When it was my turn, I kept it simple. Property map. Titled deed. Historical usage data. A notarized letter from the previous owner stating the land had never been used by any community other than his hunting group. I also submitted the photographs of the damage caused during the Camp Heal Thyself fiasco and a statement from Luis describing the bulls as livestock legally transported under standard agricultural permit. I concluded by stating that I had no issue with Karen believing whatever she wanted, painting whatever visions helped her sleep, or performing whatever ceremony she deemed necessary on her own property, but that her repeated efforts to lay symbolic claim to land she neither owned nor respected needed to stop. The judge stared at both of us for a long, tired moment before issuing a ruling so blunt it could have been carved in stone. She declared Karen's petition invalid, warned her that future attempts to assert spiritual dominion over private property without any legal foundation would be considered harassment, and suggested she seek guidance not from dear spirits, but from an actual real estate attorney. Karen tried to speak again, something about sacred geometry and energy thresholds, but the judge waved her off with a weary sigh. Case closed again. When we left the building, Karen gave me one long dramatic glare, then turned to her last remaining supporter, a man who wore a cape made of recycled soda tabs, and said something about organizing a cleansing ceremony to release the negative vibrations of the judicial system. I drove back to the mountain, back to the trees and rocks and winding paths that knew nothing of lawsuits or staff-wielding visionaries. And yet, despite the ridiculousness of it all, I felt that it wasn't over because people like Karen don't accept loss. They rebrand it, spiritualize it, fold it into the mythology of their personal crusade. Sure enough, a week later, I found a small stone cairn just outside my fence line with a wooden plaque that read, "Honor the pulse of this place." It was off my property, just enough to avoid legal trouble, and clearly intended to mark something sacred. I took a photo of it, left it untouched, and let the wind have its way with the plaque. That night, I poured myself a glass of bourbon, stepped onto the porch, and stared out at the land below, lit softly by moonlight in memory. The mountain was still mine. The trees swayed in agreement. The soil bore no marks of Karen's passage now, only the slow return of native grass, and the whisper of something older than claims or camps or chants. It was peace, real peace, the kind not found in brochures or group hugs or vibrating crystals, but earned through action, clarity, and a small herd of very helpful bulls. I leaned back, smiled, and let the silence wrap around me like a blanket. Whatever came next, I was ready. Because this land had taught me something essential. That when the loudest voices arrive with glitter and demands, the best response isn't anger or retreat. It's calm, deliberate truth carried out with strategy, a little patience, and sometimes, when absolutely necessary, a well-timed stampede. It had been nearly 3 months since the bulls walked calmly through the campfire smoke and glitter haze of Karen's mountain commune, and still not a week went by without someone bringing it up. The incident had taken on a life of its own, spreading far beyond our quiet little corner of the world. The video that one of the campers had taken, complete with shaky camera work, thunderous hoofbeats, and Karen screaming about being spiritually assaulted, went viral on every platform that enjoyed a good meltdown. Memes popped up overnight. People edited bull stampede soundtracks into famous movie scenes. A t-shirt company made a fortune selling merchandise that read "Survive the bull tsunami" and "Let the horns set you free." My mailbox filled with fan mail from people I'd never met. One woman from Arizona offered to marry me if I promised to teach her how to defend her land with livestock. A group of college students in Vermont sent me a framed print of their favorite still from the video. Karen mid-yell, a bull behind her sniffing a drum set and a camper in the background doing what looked like a terrified cartwheel over a cooler. Even Luis, humble as ever, got swept up in the fame. He started receiving requests to rent his bulls for weddings, music videos, even corporate retreats. He politely declined them all, save for one documentary crew that promised to treat the animals with respect, and offered him a lifetime supply of apple molasses cubes. He accepted that one, said it was the only honest trade he'd ever been offered by someone in a leather vest. Meanwhile, the land returned to its rhythm. I spent my mornings walking the fence lines, checking for broken posts or signs of unwanted visitors, though none dared return after the spectacle. Even Karen, in all her boundless energy and cosmic righteousness, seemed to finally understand that some battles could not be won with megaphones and self-printed permits. After the court dismissed her second attempt to declare my land part of a mystical sovereign nation, she quietly retreated into the margins. Occasionally, I would spot her around town, standing at the farmer's market behind a table selling jars of wildflower-infused moonwater, and talking to anyone who would listen about how her consciousness had been imprisoned by colonial law, but would soon rise again. Most people smiled, nodded politely, and moved on. She was still loud, still eccentric, but her following had dwindled to a few stubborn idealists and one guy who just liked the free herbal tea. The rest had scattered, embarrassed or disillusioned, or both. One of them, a young woman named Heather, who had once offered me a Reichian session in exchange for letting her paint my gate, actually returned to apologize. She walked up my driveway one afternoon holding a mason jar full of apology granola and said she'd had no idea Karen was just making it all up as she went. She told me that the whole thing had felt like a beautiful dream until the bulls showed up and reminded her that reality still existed whether people liked it or not. I thanked her, took the granola, and told her I appreciated the honesty. She smiled, then handed me something else, a t-shirt. It read, "Respect the land or meet the herd." After that, the cabin felt more like home than it ever had. Not because I'd won some war or gone viral, but because the land had been tested and stood firm. Every tree, every rock, every trail and ridgeline had seen the chaos and returned to silence. There was something comforting in that. I started planting again, repaired the vegetable beds, rebuilt the fire pit with stone taken from the upper ridge. I even added a new feature, something small but satisfying, a motion-triggered speaker system installed just beyond the main gate. When someone approached the path uninvited, the speakers would emit the low, unmistakable bellow of a Highland bull. It was subtle, not aggressive, just enough to make someone pause and think, maybe I should turn around. It worked wonders. A couple of hikers wandered too close one afternoon and nearly dropped their water bottles when the sound echoed through the trees. They backed away slowly, hands raised like they'd walked into the middle of a wildlife documentary. I later saw them post on a local hiking forum warning others that the land was protected by mysterious forces and possibly cursed. I didn't correct them. Life returned to simplicity. Quiet mornings, long afternoons filled with work that made my hands sore and my mind still. Evenings spent on the porch, watching clouds drift across the valley like ghost ships sailing through blue sky. The cabin, once a place of escape, had become something more. It was now a line drawn in earth and stone, a declaration that some things were still worth protecting, not with noise or outrage, but with presence, persistence, and yes, the occasional well-trained bull. People who knew what had happened would sometimes ask if I regretted any of it, if it had been too much, if I'd gone too far. But how could I regret defending my home with the same thoughtfulness I'd used to build it? I didn't seek revenge. I just set things right. And in doing so, I learned something strange and wonderful about boundaries. Not the kind marked with wire or law, but the deeper kind, the ones that hold the soul steady when the world tries to rewrite your story. One afternoon, I got a letter handwritten. No return address. Inside was a photo, a simple printout of the old campsite just before the bulls arrived. And on the back, a note. It read, "I came for healing, but you reminded me what truth looks like. Thank you for not backing down. Signed, just another camper." I pinned it to the wall inside the cabin next to a map of the ridge trails and a picture of Luis with Paco, Thunder, and Basil standing proud behind him. It reminded me that even when things go off the rails, when people lose themselves in noise and illusion, truth has a way of cutting through. And sometimes the truth has horns. Summer rolled into fall. The leaves began to change, covering the land in a patchwork of gold and fire. The air grew crisp, the nights colder. I lit fires in the stove again, stacked fresh wood, and watched as the first early snow dusted the treetops. Karen, for all her insistence, was nowhere to be seen. Perhaps she had finally moved on, found another field to turn into a vision board. Or maybe she was still out there, waiting for the next opportunity to declare herself ruler of an imaginary realm. Either way, I no longer cared. The land was whole. The peace was real. And in the quiet that followed the chaos, I found something better than revenge. Better than internet fame, even better than the satisfaction of watching someone run screaming in front of a bull. I found stillness. I found home. And just before the year closed out, Luis came up one last time. He brought Paco with him just for a visit. We stood together by the edge of the clearing, watching the bull nudge snow off a tree trunk with his horns, and talked about the way things used to be before noise filled every corner of life. Luis handed me something wrapped in cloth. I opened it slowly. It was a hand-carved figure of a bull, its stance strong, its head lowered slightly, carved from oak and etched with the date of the camp incident.
On the base, it read, "Let no one trample what you've made sacred." I nodded, said nothing.
Louis clapped me on the shoulder, smiled, and left as quietly as he came.